In this video, I'm going to show you a couple different ways to create beams of light and atmospheric effects in Photoshop CC 2015. All right, let's get started. So this is an image I shot last summer, and if you stick around to the end of this video, I'll have a link pop up to a behind the scenes video that shows how I shot this and how I lit this. So we had basically two lights, and we had a bare speed light over to camera left, and that's giving her that strong highlight. So I thought this would be a good candidate to show you some beams of light and atmospheric effects. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom out by hitting Command- on the Mac, and then I'm going to hit the B key for my brush tool. I'm going to come down to the lower right. I'm going to click here, and that creates a new layer. I created two. I only need one, so that's a blank layer. Now, if I hit the D key, that makes sure I have black and white for my brush tool for foreground and background. If I hit the X, I can toggle back and forth. So I have a white brush. My opacity is set at 100%. My flow is at 30. Now, if I click outside this image on the corner, if I hold the Shift key, the next spot I click on the image, that will create a straight line from my last point. So I'll show you what I mean. And you can see we have that ray of light coming from the corner. I'll move slightly here, hold Shift. You can see I have another beam of light. I'll move it again, click Shift. And you can see I have these different entry points for these beams of light just by holding Shift, and that gives me that straight line. Now, if that appears to be too strong, I'll zoom in so you can see it a little better. Now what I'll do is I'll come over here and I'll toggle that on and off. Now that's before and that's after. Now if those beams seem too strong, what you can do is you come up to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and you can reduce that. Say, let's go with 70% pixel blur of a radius of 70%. Watch how it affects it. And that's just going to smooth that out just a little bit. And then if you think that's too much, what you can do is come over here and you can reduce the opacity of that. And you can also come up and add a little bit of noise. So that'll just give you a little bit of grain and make it a little bit more natural looking. So if you hit 2%, and that'll just add a little bit of grain to that atmospheric effect or that beam of light. So that's just one way to do it. But let me show you how to do it with a color. So I'll get rid of that layer. I'm going to create a new layer again. I'm going to zoom out, Command-, and then we'll choose a color. So I'll come over to my foreground. I'll click here. Let's say we go with a warmish color there. Let's say right about there. So it's kind of a warm sunlight color. Again, I'm going to adjust the size of my brush with my bracket key. I'm going to click here outside, hit Shift, and just click on her shoulder there. And then I'll create these beams of light. And these ones have a bit more of a warmer tone to them than the original ones did. And you can see that I'm just sort of varying the entry point. So that's kind of handy if you're trying to make it look like you've got beams of light coming through a window. In this case, it's sort of like beams of light through the canopy. Now I'll zoom in so you can see it a little better. And once again, those beams are a little strong. So what we can do is Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. And if we wanted to blur it a little more, we can say, let's go 90 and say OK. And that's just going to diffuse that a little more. And again, I can add some noise and I can reduce the opacity of that so that it looks a little more natural. And if you think that's a little fake, we can reduce it a little more and just sort of just bring in some subtle beams and atmospheric effects. Now that's just one way to do that. Now another way is I could just create another layer and I can just create a really big brush. So if I got a really big soft brush, keeping my opacity at 100, my flow at 30, I could just tap on the image lightly, tap again, I can just swipe it, and then again we have sort of this effect of a soft kind of light coming from the upper corner of the image. And again, if you think that's too strong, you can blur it and you can also reduce the opacity. So let's get rid of that layer. And so I'll show you another way to do something which is quite interesting actually, and I'll show you that in a second. Here we go. We can create a gradient. If I go to my gradient tool, now you can see here it's on linear, but it's on the bottom. If I want it to be the upper right, I believe if I hit -45, there it changed it to the upper left there, so it looks more like the sunlight effect. Now I can change that color if I want. If I just come down here, I can click here, click on the color, and I can lessen that a little bit, make it a little whiter, and then just say OK, and OK there. And again, if I think that's too much, I can bring the opacity down and just sort of bring in that soft ray of light. Now that's just using a gradient. Now there's one other thing I want to show you that's pretty cool. So let me just get rid of that gradient And let's see if this doesn't always work every time I try it, but I'll hit a V key. There's a polygonal tool. I'll click on that. Now, if I drag this, I can create sort of like a beam of light going this way. Now, I can have this any color. This could be white. Just using this as an example. Now, if I go filter, again with a blur, and I'm going to go with a higher blur pixel radius there. I'm going to hit rasterize first, and I'm going to go with 1000. And that'll take a second to render. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the cloud effect. So that sort of gives you a bit of a fog. And I'll show you how that looks in a second as soon as this renders. And what I'm going to do is I'll add a mask to this, and then you'll see it in a second. All right, so that's similar to the gradient tool. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a mask. Hold the Option key, click there. I've got a mask. I'm going to say Filter, Render, Clouds. Now that's going to give me a cloud pattern over that mask. Now you can see that's sort of got that warm cloud look. We could have gone with white. It doesn't really matter. Now what I can do is if I hit Command T, you can see I have a box there that I can stretch. So I could stretch that cloud look to go over the whole entire image. I hit Return, and then that will do basically just sort of create that new layer for us. Now I'll just make it bigger so you can see better. Now, if I had used white, it probably would have looked a little better. Now, there's a couple things you can do to this. If you go to your blend modes, if you hit soft light, you can see that it's just really faint there. Can you see it's sort of there? And then you basically can just reduce that opacity. So it can be just a real faint effect, however strong you want it to look, basically. So that's one thing you can do. You can play with your blend modes. We can go back to our normal mode. And then another thing you can do too is you could use your black brush. So if I have the B key on the black brush, and I just want to make sure I've got that. So I just want to make sure I'm off that polygonal tool. Okay, I'm just on that mask. And if I can get my brush to work, let me just zoom out. Okay, there's my brush. And then I'll just shrink that a bit. So if I have a black brush, I can just paint on areas of the image where I don't want this fog effect to take place. So if I just sort of wanted to look like fog was coming in from one side, then I could just use this image for that. Or if I didn't want it to appear on her face, I could just sort of take some of it off using the brush. So there's really lots of different ways you can do this. And then again, I can just reduce that opacity to just sort of a small amount of just this fog effect coming in. So it's really up to you how you want to use these tools. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you found this video helpful, share it on the web with your fellow photographers. And I'll have a link pop up right now that shows you how I shot the behind the scenes video for this. And you'll see the lighting setup and all that. So anyway, check that out if you want to see that. Anyway, thanks again for watching. My name's Craig Becta, and I'll see you in the next video.